From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 54. We're actually going to have a little bit of a change of pace this week as we have a guest host filling in for me. John O'Neill, our Director of Performance at Cressey Sports Performance, Massachusetts, is going to take the baton and help out with some content creation. He's always been super intrigued with the sprint, agility, and quickness aspect of training, so he's going to be interviewing movement expert Lee Taft on the topic as it relates to improving baseball performance. You've got a big-time nerd in John with respect to movement skills, and you've got one of the best in the business in Lee, so we're in for a really good show. This podcast interview is timely as Lee's popular Certified Speed and Agility Coach course is on sale for $150 off this week. I don't get behind many certifications, but this is one that over-delivers on a number of fronts. I actually think so highly of Lee and his work that we invited Lee to film it at our Massachusetts facility just a few years ago. And it's now become mandatory viewing for all of our staff members at both Cressey Sports Performance facilities. I'd strongly encourage you to check it out, especially at this great discount. Head to ericcressey.com/CSAC to learn more. Again, that's ericcressey.com/CSAC to learn more and take advantage of this great discount.
What's up, guys? My name is John O'Neill. I'm the Director of Performance at Cressey Sports Performance in Massachusetts. Today I'm doing a guest host for Eric, and I'm bringing in a mentor and a friend of mine named Lee Taft, who's a coach known for speed development. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself.
All right. Hey, John, thanks so much for taking the time to have me on and ask, and I really appreciate it. I'm such a big fan of yours and Eric and all that you guys have done for it's funny because everybody thinks that, obviously your niche is baseball, but the stuff that you do is so prevalent for every athlete. So huge fan. Thanks for having me on. And, I've been in the profession for quite a while now, and because of guys like you and the research that you do and the clinical studies and trying things and then sharing it with the rest of us, I'm a lifelong learner. And the older I get, I feel like the less I know in terms of there's so much more stuff coming out. But, I kind of started my career as a phys ed teacher, immediately went into strength and conditioning. And so for, the past 3 decades, I've kind of been in the field of coaching and strength and conditioning, and find myself, like I said, a lifelong learner. And thankfully, guys like you keep us on our toes and staying sharp.
Well, I appreciate that, Lee. What's your day-to-day look like right now?
Yeah, right now it's doing a lot of virtual type stuff because of obviously our current situation here. But we spend a lot of time creating content, a lot of writing, a lot of producing of video, short videos. Got some projects coming up. Just kind of launched a little virtual program for kids that are stuck at home and can't do a lot. So that's kind of what's going on right now, and also doing several podcasts and things like that of my own. So yeah, staying busy.
Awesome. So you're definitely known for speed development and change of direction speed. How did that become your niche?
Well, it's funny. I the other day was on a podcast with a bunch of interns through this company, and that question came up. And really, when I look back at it, it's funny how in strength and conditioning, things that you're pretty good at is where we tend to go. A lot of times you'll see, big, strong guys just love the weight room. It's a passion for them. Well, I was not a big guy. I was fairly strong, but I wasn't a big guy, but I was always fast. I was quick. So I played college athletics, played 4 sports in high school. And, my ability to, move and be real quick was always there. So it fascinated me. And then I started to study it. I started to look more at it. And even when I was in college, I kind of started to break down why we do certain things. But really what got me, John, was when my coaches used to say, well, you can't do that. You can't take that step or whatever. And I kept thinking, well, I'm not purposely doing it. So it kind of started me down the road of studying what is speed? What does it really mean? And why do we do things that we do? So that's what got me intrigued. I was quick. I got interested in learning why I was quick and then why other athletes were quick. And it just kind of led me down this path. So it's been really cool to study it.
Awesome. Let's shift gears a little bit. So we'll get into some baseball specific stuff for our audience, and
Yeah.
that'll probably carry us throughout most of the podcast here. But I know you've worked with a lot of baseball players in the past. What are the kind of the top tier things that you're trying to look for in youth baseball players in terms of qualities that you're trying to develop?
Yeah, well, so if we talk about younger athletes, first of all, I'm just real big on let's develop a really good athlete. Let's develop somebody that has the ability to perform what I like to call the 7 movement patterns of speed. So, just to quickly review that would be the ability to accelerate straight ahead, and then the ability to sprint, the ability to shuffle laterally, the ability to laterally run, or some people might call that a crossover, but laterally run. And then we might have to have the ability to backpedal even a couple steps in baseball, and then hip turn to be able to retreat, and then be able to jump vertically. So, and now if we get a young athlete that can do those 7 patterns really well, what we find is the sport itself, and playing the sport and being taught the various positions of the sport, that brings out the kind of like the specific movements, or almost like the identity of how a baseball player moves, because the sport demands you to move a certain way. So when I deal with young athletes and I want to develop athleticism or speed and quickness in them, it's about just developing them as an athlete first, and then allowing the baseball exposure to bring out the baseball skills. Now, having said that, if I get a young kid, maybe even a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid who's really struggling, maybe getting to their backhand side on a ground ball, maybe they're an infielder, especially a short infielder, then we got to be able to take that pure athleticism that they've developed, and now give them a little bit of a nudge into how to do that with being able to reach their hand across their body to make a backhand play. And there's various ways we can do that. But first and foremost, with any kid, any sport, especially baseball, if we can give them that good foundation of athleticism, we're so far ahead of the game.
Lee, I think that's an awesome answer, especially bringing up the 7 patterns. I mean, I've seen you speak multiple times, and I think that was a light bulb moment for me as well as other coaches. When we first come into the industry, we learn, there's the squat hinge, push and pull in the weight room, back from Dan John and Mike Boyle stuff.
Yeah.
How did you originally come up with the 7 patterns of movement? Was that yours? Was that taken from somewhere else? Was that developed over a long period of time? Can you speak a little bit on the origin of coming up with those 7?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So early on, when I was young in the profession, one of the things that for whatever reason, and again, back when I first started doing this in the later 80s and 90s, I didn't have access to YouTube. I couldn't just, bring something up real quick and watch, so there was a lot of time just watching. But what I used to do is we used to have these big old clunky cameras, and I would set them up in my facility or in my garage, and I would film myself going through various movements. And all I wanted to do was see what it is that how does my body move in these different directions and these different patterns. So what I started to do is say, okay, if I'm playing any sport, particularly a team sport, I'm going to have to move in these directions, and then I'm going to have variations of those directions. So I just started to put together, all right, if I'm going to teach somebody else this, what are the simple patterns that we have to do? And that was really what I came up with those 7 movement patterns, and knowing that there's variations, because I can move on any angle. Like I can combine kind of like, let's say there was a bunt hit at like 30 degrees off to my right. Well, now I'm accelerating forward, but my initial step is kind of like that lateral run concept just because it was off center. So immediately it forces me to open to the front side and then run through. So that's how it came out. I just started playing with it. I'm thinking, all right, can I keep this simple? And those were the 7 patterns that we came up with. And then you add, like, even jumping. Well, we can jump off 2 feet, land on 2 feet, which is a jump. Then I can leap and I can hop. So that stuff kind of gets added in later. But the initial 7 were just stuff that I started playing with. And also having a phys ed background, we had to learn all the locomotion type patterns. And that kind of helped give me a real good framework.
Awesome. So for the listeners, for those of you who maybe are in the baseball community more than the strength and conditioning community, a couple of the patterns that would be maybe difficult to picture unless you put it in context. A lateral run step is very similar to a base stealer, so how they take off. And then a hip turn is the other one that sounds a little obscure. A hip turn is like, picture a center fielder with balls hit directly over their head. They're not backpedaling for a while. They're just quickly repositioning and going. So it's basically turning your body around.
Exactly.
And I think that'll help clarify, especially the other ones like acceleration and sprinting and shuffling and backpedaling. I think people will be able to picture. Speaking on the lateral run step, can you elaborate on, 1, how you teach that, and 2, why it's important to do it that way versus a traditional crossover step?
Yeah, and I really am thankful you asked that question, because I think that's in every aspect of fitness or strength and conditioning, there are sticking points we all have, right? We talk about different things in different areas, and this is one of them in the speed world. Is, do we use a crossover or do we use a lateral run or a repositioning step or whatever? So what I did, John, way back, and I've talked about this a lot, is I never really just created my own patterns. What I did is I watched and I studied, and I just watched a lot of athletes. And what I tried to do was go back to like the 40s and the 50s and 60s and watch professional athletes and, and whatever film I could find on collegiate and whatever other level, and see how they moved naturally without guys like you and I, without a skills coach or a performance coach or a speed coach. They just moved naturally. I noticed they did exactly the same thing that guys do now in 2020. We may have just kind of made guys a little stronger now, maybe a little faster, but technically they move the same. So this lateral run, what it basically means and what it is that we're trying to do versus the crossover, which is commonly taught, but doesn't really exist that much. So let me actually go crossover first. What we typically think happens is, let's just look at base stealing for a second, because that's the easiest to identify with. If I have somebody taking a lead and getting in a pretty good steal stance or an athletic stance, I'm going to turn to their right to go towards second base. The crossover would typically be described by most coaches as, we're going to use that front leg to be able to push off and bring that back leg, so the left leg, around towards second base. The problem is, when you watch an athlete move, if you just watch them and study them, and I've studied hundreds and hundreds of athletes stealing and fielding a ball, and it's a similar pattern. What happens is, I have to abide by laws of human movement. So for me to begin changing inertia, which is our first law, I have to be able to push my mass in the direction I want to go. Well, the front leg automatically gets deleted from that because it can't push. It can only pull. And we know that's much weaker, especially when I want to be quick. So if I use my left leg and I give a quick push, almost like a quick nudge, that starts moving my center of mass or my belly button towards second base. That gives me a split second to reposition that front foot. And now that front foot becomes just like me coming out of the blocks if I'm a 100-meter sprinter. It's positioned to drive down and back. It's positioned so I can recruit good hamstring and glutes, my hips, and I can really push strong. And then that back leg now comes from being towards first base and immediately gets driven towards second. But the difference is, we could say it's crossing over the midline of the body, but really what's happening, because that front foot is opened up. It's no longer crossing over that step. It's just running in a normal gait pattern like we would if we were to run, accelerate, or sprint. So the lateral run basically means we allow the backside to push, we allow the front side to open, and then we allow the front side to push. So I call it pop. When I say to my athletes, hey, let's make sure give me some good pop. That just means I want them to push, open, push. I want them to push, move their body to the right, open that front foot, and then push with that front foot down and back, and then the back leg comes through. Now, if we were to do a traditional crossover like most say, we have these biomechanical issues. So my front leg, my right leg in this case, that femur and that knee and that shin really are kind of blocking the pathway of my backside leg to come through efficiently. Plus, as I mentioned before, I begin pulling with that front leg before my center of mass gets closer to second base than that front leg is. Because right now, my front leg, that right leg, is closer to second base. My center of mass or my belly button is closer to first base. And it just doesn't add up if we apply laws of physics and laws of movement. So that's kind of the difference between the two. In the crossover, if we really watch, doesn't exist that much in pure acceleration. It might be used in different contexts, but not if I need to run really quick. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully it gave the listeners kind of a picture of what we're looking at between those two skills.
No, that was great. And a couple follow-up questions I have with that. You see some base stealers that start really wide with their feet and then actually step back underneath them. So it appears like a false step, for lack of a better term. And then some base stealers who start narrow and get and step out. So they actually widen their base on that reposition step. How do you determine which or who should do which setup? Like, is there a body type or presentation that is better off starting wide and stepping underneath them versus starting narrow and stepping wide?
Yeah, that's one of the things where you kind of give an athlete a chance to find success or allow failures or limitations to tell us that we need to maybe add something different or go in a different direction. But you got to give them a chance, because here's the thing we always have to understand with that type of movement, and this is the same for an infielder, having to move laterally. It's very similar movements. Is if you have an athlete that has maybe shorter limbs and is very powerful, relative strength is really good. They can move their body mass easily, quickly, and they have no problem being able to move laterally. That athlete, I don't mind if they go a little wider, and I don't mind if they bend their knees deeper, because they're powerful. They can push through their weight easily. So now if you get an athlete like that, and when they go into let's just use the steal again. If they're going into their steal and we notice that front foot steps back, I'm okay with it coming back a little bit as long as the center of mass is moving to the right. Where I draw the line with my athletes, and this fits into my model of movement of the lateral run, is one of the rules is that center of mass has to move in the direction we're going to travel. Now, if the front foot moves back under me, maybe because the stance was a little bit wider and that was comfortable for that athlete, and they still move really quick that way, I'm okay with that, as long as they don't make a physical movement with that lead leg and the center of mass didn't go anywhere. That's what I don't want. What I want is that center of mass to move in the direction they're going to go. And if that front leg has to kind of reposition under them, just maybe sometimes it's only 2 to 3 inches, 4 inches, and to give them a positive shin angle. Now, if you take an athlete that's not as strong, not very powerful, I'm going to try to get them to come up a little higher, because a lot of times their coaches are going to try to, they're going to force a square peg into a round hole and make everybody do the same thing. Well, you can't do that, because you get this maybe just a longer, weaker athlete who can't get as low, doesn't have the power, but they're pretty reactive off the ground. I might get them a little higher, maybe a little bit more narrow. And now when they push, as long as they're moving their center of mass, and because that front leg is a little bit closer in, you probably won't see them step back, simply because they did move the center of mass laterally. It's when that center of mass doesn't move and that front foot comes way back, almost towards the left foot, that's the issue, because they made a movement, but they didn't travel anywhere. That's where you have to kind of draw the line as a coach and say, okay, we got to fix that. So that's what I'm looking for when I evaluate who should do what. But I think, John, the important thing is sometimes you got to give somebody time, right? It's just like learning a new pitch or a new swing, new technique or whatever. You got to give them a chance for the brain to say, okay, I've given everything I can. I'm exhausted trying, and that's the best I can do. Then we know how to adjust from there.
Off the top of your head, can you think of any good base stealers that started with a taller position? I'm picturing, I know Ricky Henderson is kind of probably the gold standard for base stealing, just given baseball statistics. And I think, and I could be wrong on this, but I'm picturing him with really wide feet, and he actually steps back underneath him.
He doesn't step back as much as you think, but again, as in any skill, there's a bandwidth. So sometimes when I've watched his film, he did, but it was typically when he was almost more like a secondary lead, or he was still kind of creeping out a little bit, and then he would take off. Versus when he set his feet and he locked himself in, much like a track athlete in the blocks, you're set and you're ready to jump. He was pretty good. He didn't have a tremendous setback because he was so powerful in his legs. But if you take somebody like Buxton, pretty long, and he might come up a little bit higher, he would step back with that lead leg, but his center of mass always moved to the right. Mike Trout, a little bit too, a little different runner, but big powerful guy. Same thing. Going back a little bit with Jeter. Jeter was a pretty smooth runner. Takeoff. He had pretty conventional technique. His arms were in pretty good position, and so it just depends on their current situation on that particular pitch, what they're doing. But yeah, when you get guys that are a little bit longer, like some of these, you even going back to like an A-Rod, it was a pretty big guy. They had occasionally where they would step back a little bit because they didn't load very well on that left leg, so they didn't move their mass to the right. They had to almost like turn, then start going, which could have been corrected. But some of these guys, they've done it 30,000 times, and it's tough to get them to change.
Sure. You mentioned Jeter's arms. What in particular, not just with Jeter, but what in particular are you looking for with arm action or good arm action for a base stealer?
Oh, yeah. Love that question, because here's the thing. When I've been fortunate enough to work with several, programs, major league programs. And when I talk to the players about it, I always say to them, I'm not here to change what's comfortable for you. I'm here to give you reasons why our brain and our body can be more efficient doing things a particular way. And it's like we always say, you can break the rules if you know the rules. But if you don't know the rules and you don't know the effect that they're going to have on you, you're probably going to suffer the consequences of not knowing those rules. So the arms are a perfect example. When my elbows are bent and my hands are positioned in front of, let's just say, my belt, okay, my belt line. So I'm in a good steel stance. My hands are bent. They're right about my belt level. I have a pretty fast lever there. I can move from my shoulders pretty quick. I can clear that right arm, and I can throw that left arm down towards second base, and that's kind of like turning the keys. Now, I see a lot of players who like to drop that right arm long. Some like to open the right arm and drop the left arm long. So they think that it opens them up and gives them a better chance. And I'll always say to them, I'm saying, that's fine as long as you understand what you're taking away from the stance. So now when I start symmetrical, my hands in front of my belt, almost like a gunslinger, ready to have a shootout in the West, but the hands are a little bit closer towards the belly button that way. Now, when I quickly move my hands, we're going to call that an action. Well, in physics, every action, there's a reaction. Well, when my hands move really quick, that tells my backside leg, in this case, my left leg, to push into the ground quickly because I have to be able to support that quick action with my hands. The longer my arms are, the longer it takes for that to occur And also when I have a long arm and I swing them into position, so I'm actually going to start sprinting, I'm fighting rotation. I'm fighting this torque. And I don't know that I need to have that particular torque. But again, if an athlete's comfortable with it and they're doing the other things well, I just try to help them and support them where they're at. But I just want to make sure they understand when the arms can't move and clear quick, it blocks the shoulders and the chest from turning towards second really quick. And then that delays down the whole chain. So that's the reason I'm so picky with hands, is like, let's give them the best chance to support the actual steel action and not have them become a deficit to it. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. I want to pivot a little bit away from base stealing and just get into other aspects of the game, because I know you're extremely knowledgeable about defensive setups, and I want to get into generating bat speed a little bit later.
Yeah.
The defensively, so if let's say you're a casual fan, right, but obviously you're always watching movement. What are you looking for in defensive setups from an infielder?
Well, and this is probably the most maybe a little bit controversial for some people. And again, I go back to almost like that base stealing concept. Some athletes, I'm okay with them getting lower in their stance. Others, I need them higher. But in general, what a baseball infielder needs to be able to do, because I can't think, other than tennis, I can't think of a sport that is so explosively fast. Things happen so quick. Any poor action, you're out of the play. The ball's by you. It's in the hole, and you don't even have a chance to get to it. But if you can kind of set up a little bit better, I think you're better off. So what I like to look for is, almost like in the sport of tennis, as the serve is about to be contacted, the person that's returning the serve does what we call a split step, or a jump stop is often called. So with the infielders, I like to see them have this kind of this preload. All it is they take one or two little creep steps in, and that's dependent on if that's what they like to do. But as long as they're kind of moving forward with their center of mass a little bit, and then they just kind of preload into a split step. So their feet go from narrow on the walk up on the kind of this creeping forward to immediately getting a little bit wider. And that wide stance allows them to be able to move laterally forward or backwards. But when I do this little jump step or this split step and both feet hit, it's like a pre-stretch. And that pre-stretch allows me to have a quicker takeoff. And so I like to see them kind of creep in. Now, here's the part that sometimes I'll have disagreements with coaches on this, and I get it. I understand what their concerns are. When an infielder is told to start really low, glove way down, get really, really low, the problem with that is it minimizes how quick they can be when they have to have better range, when they have to get deep into the hole or go after maybe a broken bat, dribbler or a bunt or something. So when they're up a little bit, so when their knees are a little bit straighter, and I'm not talking about standing up straight, I'm just talking about a little bit higher, that allows me to have a better stretch shortening cycle, that quick elastic rubber band. I can like pop and go really quick. But when I'm shorter and way low, yeah, I might be down for the ball if it's hitting straight at me, but it's not like I don't have time to drop my hands within that, so many split seconds to get down there. So that's probably the one thing that I look for the most is, can this infielder load and explode in any direction, as well as get their glove down and be able to make a play on a ball that's hit a line drive straight at them. So that's kind of what I like to see. Is I don't like them too low because I think they become unathletic, but at the same time, they have to find their sweet spot to be able to feel comfortable to move in any direction.
Is hand position, the way you would teach it, really similar to base stealing in terms of the levers you're trying to create and the height that you have?
Pretty similar, yeah, because again, I think you can drop your glove pretty quick, and I think it's just the nature of the sport. And the more they play, they know exactly their groove of how they're going to do that and execute the movement. But when the hands are a little bit high, maybe like palms up, it almost looks like a volleyball player libero in the back row. They kind of have their palms, elbows bent, and their palms are up, and they're ready to go. But when I have to all of a sudden go hit a hard hit ball, 10 feet off to my right or left, the arm action helps me, as where if my hands were dropped long all the way down, that actually hurts that initial step. So yeah, I do. I kind of, and again, find the sweet spot for each player, but I think that helps a lot.
Sure, I think that's great. I don't think that's something that's that prevalent in terms of the way it's taught. Like I know probably all of us growing up at some point were taught get really low and get your glove
Yep.
close to the ground and wait. And the longer you have to wait in that position, the more uncomfortable you get, and the stiffer you get, and the less reactive you get.
Exactly.
And so
Yeah.
that makes a ton of sense. As an outfielder, what defensive setup traits do you see the best outfielders possessing?
Yeah, so obvious an outfielder, the biggest difference, the two biggest difference is the sight line. Okay, so not that they can't be really low and still see the pitch and see the catcher's mitt and see the batter, but it's easier when they're standing up higher, and it depends on where they're standing, especially if you're a center fielder. So the one thing that the advantage they have is obviously they have a little bit more time. And again, going back to my point of this elastic reflex, this stretch, this rubber band action that we have built into our system, if they're really low in the outfield, they're going to have a hard time moving quick. So I like them a little bit higher, and I like them doing the same thing like I said before, is I like them just kind of drop into, as soon as they see that pitch and it's about to get to the catcher, split your feet, kind of preload, and that allows them to have an explosive move in any direction. It allows them to reposition to go deep for a ball hit back to the warning track, but it allows them to also take off and going forward. And the other thing it allows them to do is it allows them to be more corrective in a poorly read ball. So if they, see a ball that comes off the bat and it just looks like it's a rocket, but actually it's probably about, 15 feet to 15 yards short of what they saw, they can open their hips, maybe take that first step back and then realize they have to go forward. Well, if they're constantly changing their levels, their height, that diminishes how quick they can be in the direction they have to go. But if they stay with a semi-bent knee, John, it would almost be like the height of a jump shot, right? If you see a guy shooting a foul shot or a jump shot, they bend their knees, they bend their hips, they load their ankles, but they're not way down squatting. Kind of the same thing for a baseball outfielder. They can really be explosive there, and they can move in any direction, but they can self-correct when they made a bad read a lot easier that way.
Sure, I think that's awesome. The jump shot analogy the free throw analogy makes a ton of sense because we talk about being high, but I think sometimes people confuse being high with being unathletic. Whereas everyone shooting a free throw is still in an athletic position, but it's a high athletic position.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
So I know, just speaking on outfielder stuff, I've seen some of your stuff in the past where you talk about ability to turn your hips away from your head or turn your head away from your hips. So picture for the listeners, outfielder, balls hit over their head. They have to still be able to track the ball by looking, let's say, over their left shoulder, but their hips are actually pointed, back into the right. So can you talk a little bit about, how you train that kind of stuff and why you train it and where you think it fits in?
Yeah, and this really, really kind of cool stuff for you, especially if we go back to kind of like the first question of what do we do with training young baseball players? These are the kind of things that if players, they play a lot in the parks and they play a lot of different sports, they learn these skills, but us as practitioners can help these athletes understand that your ability to disassociate your lower body and your upper body, and also your eyes, disassociate your eyes from the direction your body's traveling. So your example, perfect. Got a ball hit over my head. I can't turn my eyes to where I'm going to run to because I can't track the ball. So I have to have this freedom in my neck, or we can call it a cervical spine. I have to have some freedom in my thoracic spine just below the neck. And I have to have this ability to move through my hips. Now, the way we can develop that is in the initial stages, we develop it with simple drills like a karaoke. It's a drill that whether people like to implement those or not, it's not for any other reason than it would be than just doing a basic mobility drill to prepare an athlete to practice. So we can teach the athlete and we can say to them, hey, keep your head straight ahead, but I want you to rotate your hips to the right and then rotate your butt to the right, and which that means we're getting a nice swivel. Now I can say, let's do that karaoke again, but I want you to put your head over your right shoulder the entire time. So now we're challenging ends of range of motion, and we're finding how do they get the rest of the range of motion if, let's say, my cervical spine doesn't rotate real well. I'm still going to do the drill, but I'm going to find it somewhere else. So there's a series that I have, and I call it my 180 series. So imagine you're standing on, let's just say we're standing on first base, and I said, go run to second base, but when you get halfway, turn around and backpedal the rest of the way. Okay, that would be a 180. All right, so now I'm back out in the outfield, and I'm facing home base. And I start backpedaling, and then all of a sudden on a command or maybe a ball's thrown over my head, I turn and I start running towards the wall or the fence out in center field. Well, my head has to locate that ball. So we start to disassociate the lower body. The midsection kind of gets lagged a little bit, and then the upper body obviously leads it, and then the head finally comes towards the end. So the ability to be able to do those type of skills, maintain a straight line, because that's the problem a lot of young kids have. They might be able to not turn their head in the direction their body's going, but they end up running almost like a C pattern versus a straight line. So this 180 series allows me to do it forward in turning to backwards. I can go backwards and turning to forward, and then I can delay my head to look in the direction that I was going, and then go fast with my head to look in the direction that I'm currently going. And what that does is that teaches body awareness, spatial awareness, and as a coach, it allows me to assess, oh man, this kid has a real hard time going over their left side, but their right side, they're pretty good. So then I can kind of program maybe a little extra work going over their left side. So that's kind of what it is. It's really fun stuff to do, and it's so effective. And I've worked with this with major league players down to little league guys, and it's amazing how some people struggle with it until they get the pattern down. Then they become real efficient with it.
I think that's awesome, and it's another one of those things that you bring up that the training community doesn't necessarily look into or traditionally hasn't done. I know when I first saw that stuff probably about a year ago now, it was a little bit of a light bulb, like, oh, wow, we've never actually trained that, even though all of our athletes are expected to do that once they get into their season. The other thing that's similar to that, and it's actually something that Ty brought up to me recently, our friend of ours, Ty Terrell, who works for the Hawks, but is he called it curvilinear running. So basically mimicking as if you're running around the bases, just getting used to actually turning at full speed. Is that something that you would incorporate at all in programming?
Definitely, without a doubt, because the thing, and you, what you do with that is you first of all, you're teaching them in the sport of baseball, they have to be able to turn to the left. So very much like a 400-meter runner in track and field, right? You just take a left turn and you're pretty good. So when I run the bases and I'm coming off first base and going towards second, eventually towards third and home, I have different actions in my feet, right? I have one that's going to pronate a lot and one that's going to supinate a little bit more. And so, and then learning how can I fight those forces, because there's this kind of this unseen force that's always pulling me towards the fence, towards outfield. And if I stand up too straight, in other words, if I stand vertical as if I'm standing statically, the force that's pulling me out towards center field is going to win. It's going to pull me off my line. I'm not going to be very effective. So one of the things we try to do is teach the athletes, can you maintain, and we do this gradually by building speed from 50% and work our way up, can we maintain high levels of speed and still maintain a pathway that's conducive to us being effective base runners? Now, going along with that is we don't often think of baseball as a deceleration sport in terms of foot speed. We think of it, we accelerate, we make a play, play's over. Well, when you get a first base, or excuse me, a ball that's hit and they round first base and they kind of get a little stretch saying, hey, I don't know, maybe I can go. But then all of a sudden they put the brakes on and come back. That ability to hold that turn and then quickly perform what I call like it's just, let's say a rotational stop. It'd be just like running a shuttle run, really. We have to be able to plant the foot and then quickly redirect back to first base. So it's all relative to how well we can curve and run on that curve and then be able to manage our center of mass to stop it and get back. So yeah, big fan of that stuff. And I also think when you're dealing with the younger kids, you got to get them to run both ways because that's just helping overall athleticism and symmetry. So yeah, definitely I'm a big fan of that.
And that probably makes sense in terms of the base stealing stuff too. Like training a higher level guy on a lateral run step, you're probably talking left to right most of the time.
Yeah.
Younger guys, you're probably spending equal amounts of time or close to it. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. Because especially because usually most players, especially when they're younger, they play both ways. So we know when you're going to steal a base, you're trying to get to the right, but you might have to get your hands back on the bag. But when you're an infielder or an outfielder, you don't know. You're going to have to go right and left, oftentimes just as equally. So we want to make sure that they have that ability to use that lateral run step in both directions.
Awesome. Going back to some base running stuff, actually. So when you have a younger athlete in, and it doesn't even matter if it's a younger athlete, it could be anyone. Let's say for some reason you didn't ask them what sport they played, and you just watch them take off. You watch them accelerate. What are the dead giveaways to you that, all right, this person's a baseball player?
John, just to clarify, do you mean more like if they're just taking off and running from a staggered stance, or
Yep.
if they just...
Yeah, from a staggered stance, like let's say it's like, all right, let me see you run 15, 20 yards. Just no coaching. What are the giveaways that that's a baseball player?
Well, one of the things that I see a lot with baseball players is they don't tend to always open up the stride as much. They don't tend to push and kind of get more towards that upwards posture that we might see like a soccer player who tends to sometimes have a shorter stride, but they stand upright more. Basketball players stand upright more, right? Baseball, because whether I'm a defender or I'm a base runner, at some point I'm going to get down. I'm going to get my hands down. So there's a lot of times a forward lean, and which means we're not always going to have as much leg separation as possible because they're trying to get started so quick and they turn their legs over really fast. And it's funny because it was probably about 2.5, 3 weeks ago I assessed a high school kid who happens to be a baseball player. But first thing I did is here, starting a staggered stance, take off and run. And that's exactly what he had. Very short, quick turnover, but not much separation. And he had a fairly decent upward body forward lean, like he was trying to get his hands down to slide into second base or third base. And so those are some of the things that I'll see. And along with that is the shorter arm carriage. So rather than having a nice long forward and backwards arm swing in the first couple steps, it tends to be shorter and a little bit tighter. But that's one area I try to correct them because then they can actually accelerate better. So yeah, those are some of the things that I typically will see with a baseball guy.
I think that makes a ton of sense. From what I've seen with our youth guys, I think the front side mechanics on arm action is difficult to teach a lot of times with the baseball guys because they're, like you said, so used to their hands coming down into something, whether that's to dive or slide into a base, whether that's to go field the ground ball or to, if you're an outfielder, run and scoop a ball up. But that forward lean and hands that don't really get through in the front is something that I feel like I see all the time with that. And then from an athletic development standpoint, for us, just in terms of getting overall speed up, that's something that we spend a lot of time on.
Yeah. And the other thing we forget about, and you see this in other sports such as tennis or lacrosse, is when you run with a glove in your hand, if you want your hand to move quickly, you have to bend more at the elbow. So now I can move that lever faster. But if I try to run with a long arm and I have the weight of that glove, especially if I'm a younger kid, that's hard to do, and it slows my gait down. But if I bend my elbows more, and that's why sometimes we don't see them get the arm gait that we would see on, let's say, a track athlete who is, the ideal form. But so sometimes we got to understand, the glove distorts the pattern a little bit, and rightfully so, because it's a heavier implement than just the weight of their hand.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think that's also something that we probably also forget about. The fact that they are, the glove. It's not like the glove is changing hands, so they're constantly driven to one side repeatedly when they run or when they play. What are there any other main mistakes that you see the baseball community consistently making when it comes to training speed?
Well, I think some of the things, if we, and there are many things that I think we have to understand is when I see, especially youth programs or even travel programs like an AAU type program, is a lot of times the coaches they'll say, okay, we're going to work on speed now, but they give very little recovery time. It's more like almost like an interval type training, like they'll sprint to second base and then they'll jog back to first base, then they sprint to second base, or first, second, third, and then jog back. And so some of the mistakes that we're making, and not that stuff is wrong if you're trying to improve their conditioning and maybe their endurance of speed, but if you want to make athletes faster, and I can't think of too many sports of where you have to be so explosively quick and fast than baseball, because it happens so fast. Pitches are so fast, and the ball coming off the bat is so fast that you have to be quick. So if I'm not in great condition shape, I can still be a high effective baseball player if I have good speed. So I think doing too much conditioning when the goal is speed. Again, I'm not against conditioning. I'm just saying when it's for speed. And then the other thing is, if we go back to kind of earlier in our talk, is when the athletes are asked to get really low, on infield, on any other position, maybe even base stealing or outfield or whatever, when they're asked to get really, really low because we think that that's a good thing. But what happens is we've put our athletes in such a tough position to be able to be explosive and to be successful that we end up getting frustrated with the athlete, when really what we did is we gave them a bad strategy. So I think allowing the athlete to kind of show us how they move best, and then work with them to maybe make it a little bit cleaner, a little bit better, and still abide by human laws of movement, which none of us are going to be if we want to be the best movers. So yeah, those are kind of the things that I look at, and I think that we have to make sure we work on it. And then not to belabor the point here, is we have to understand that when an athlete moves their feet in a certain way, so let's say all of a sudden a bunt occurs and the infielder repositions their feet. In other words, maybe one foot all of a sudden jabs behind them to take off, and a coach says, no, that's a false step. You're not going as fast. Well, first of all, the athlete didn't consciously think to do that. They just reacted. When that occurs, the body is trying to self-correct from a position of where they can't accelerate as fastly to a position where they can accelerate quicker, and they're using things such as stretch shortening and stiffness and all that. So those are some of the things that are a pet peeve of mine, is when we try to correct something the athlete does intuitively that actually helps them move better.
Awesome. I love that answer. Particularly a couple of my follow-up questions, unrelated, were going to be about conditioning related stuff for baseball. I think we see that all the time. So I think part of the success that we have with college kids over the summer is it's the only 2-3 month block of the year where they're not doing a ton of endurance type training that they have to do with their teams, or they think they're supposed to do throughout the year. And then all of a sudden we get them for 10-12 weeks and they focus on just getting stronger, and their conditioning, if you want to call it that, is more speed focused versus endurance focused. And they start throwing harder, they put on body mass, etc. What if, let's say, hypothetical world, you were running a college baseball program, what would the conditioning for a pitcher between starts look like?
Yeah, well, so I think the important things about conditioning that we often don't look at. So a lot of times when most coaches look at conditioning, they consider it as, can this person sustain a heart rate for a certain amount of time? So, and obviously that falls under the lines of endurance and conditioning. But when I look at conditioning, I need it to do a couple things for my athletes. I need it to be able to allow them to sustain a work capacity and build a work capacity to do more work during training and or practice. So maybe we got a 2-hour practice, and maybe they have to go after that, they have to go to the strength coach or whatever it may be. The ability to have a capacity, an aerobic capacity to be able to sustain that, to me, is really, really important. So to me, in baseball, I think you've got this aerobic capacity, which I would spend time on, but I'm going to do that not always in just this long distance running or riding a bike or rowing or whatever. It's going to be through submaximal work efforts. Maybe it's doing some medicine ball work. Maybe it's doing some calisthenics. Maybe it's doing some skipping and different variations for a sustained period of time. And it's keeping their heart rate in a range, anywhere between maybe 130, 150, 125, 150 for a sustained time of maybe 20 to 25 minutes, 30 minutes, but doing things that are helping them become effective movers as well. Now, that's going to build not only the movement capacity of the drills that I'm using, so I get some more bang for my buck than just having them go off on a long run, but I'm also, again, building this capacity to be able to sustain work for a longer period of time throughout their day. And it can even help them in non-baseball related stuff academically, and they're moving. They're just going to feel better. So there's where I think the benefit is. Now, if I have a pitcher just pitch a full, maybe a full game, or got a good five innings in, or 6 innings or whatever, and I want to do some work in between with them, it would certainly entail the types of things that I just talked about, but I want to make sure that they're maintaining the ability to do the skills that we're working on really, really well. So for example, maybe we're doing a body weight squat workout with, maybe 10 reps, and then immediately going to like a karaoke type drill to work on mobility of the hip. And then they get to the other side and they do maybe some kind of shoulder care, arm care work. And then they do a karaoke back, and then they go back and do another drill. So similar patterns of that nature that help them recover. Okay, so we're going to get some great blood flow. We're going to help some recovery, hopefully help some repair, but we're still working on the capacity to be a great mover, a good athlete, and work on maybe undoing some of the damage that the pitching does to them, because it's such a violent, big open stride pattern and a big deceleration moment. So those are the kind of things that I would do, John, that help them stay athletic, build capacity to recover and be able to do more work, and then hopefully kind of help recover some of the damage that occurs in the body during the game that they pitched at.
Awesome. I think that makes a ton of sense, and is definitely practical, and hopefully can be implemented by the college pitchers and coaches listening. Last main topic here. I know we have probably about 10 minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about some hitting related stuff because we haven't touched on it at all.
Yeah.
So we've used med ball throws for years to build rotational power. One aspect of your system that I think a lot of places maybe don't do or aren't aware of is this concept of med ball fake throws. So can you talk about med ball fake throws, particularly as it relates to developing bat speed or generating more exit velocity?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because it's and you know where it started. It actually started in 1991 when I was at a tennis academy in Florida, and I was trying to do kind of what the question you're asking me. I was trying to help these younger players up to the professional players had pretty good racket speed, but some of them lacked in certain areas. So I kind of, I was always the type that I just would start thinking and say, okay, what can I do? And that's how these things kind of came about. And they've evolved over the last, 3 decades. But so when you do a fake throw, couple things that you're doing is you have to train the coordination of the human system to be able to release for speed. Okay, so when I throw a ball, when I swing a bat, I have to release, generate force, and that's a coordinated pattern of itself. It's summation. It's being able to be on the inside of that foot, being able to create power through my lower extremities into my hip and my core up all the way through. Now, when we implement the fake throw, what we're doing is we're working on the ability to generate that speed very quickly, but then being able to stabilize the spine, the shoulder girdle, so and it depends on the direction we're going, but we integrate right from the foot through the entire body, has to not only generate the speed of the ball, but then instantly being able to decelerate the speed of that ball without having excessive rotation and maybe just forces that we don't want on the body. Now, if I'm going to release the ball, like I love the stuff you guys do with the throws, I'm a huge fan of those. That's actually a release. The body uncoils, it releases through the ball, so it's a very nice, not gradual, but it's a complete release of the action. When you learn to do a fake throw, it's stopping the ball quickly before the movement ends, okay, or before the release of it. And that forces this internal stiffness that helps the athlete, I guess for a lack of a better phrase, is train the core. I'm just trained to be stiff, and the core can mean whatever you want, because I include adductors, abductors, I include the whole thing, and all the way up through my T-spine and everything, and then include the shoulder. So it helps them be able to decelerate it. So now if I want to get very specific with this, I could have let's say we have a right-handed pitcher. I could have them up in the stance, so they're holding their left leg high, parallel. Then I can have them push off with that right leg, turn and rotate the left leg, stop on that left leg as if they were doing a pitch stride, but then have that medicine ball come, and then what we would say a level 2, which would mean my arms are halfway. I would bring that ball just about to the kneecap and stop it quick. So I'm learning to decelerate forces. So it's another way of kind of almost like taking the weight room and speed training and meshing them together to create this violent, and I use violent in a means of a good way, not a bad way, of being able to violently stop the body quickly and create this internal stiffness, which helps the entire kinetic chain. So hopefully that explains it. It's a lot easier to see this stuff, but there's all different kind of patterns you can use from infield, outfield, pitching, throwing, hitting, and I think it's just great stuff to help, especially with our younger athletes, learning how to stabilize the body without having to have too much feedback. We let the ball kind of give the feedback.
Yeah, I love the med ball fake throws. So we never used them before probably a year ago or so, but we used them a lot, especially with our younger guys, and started implementing it with our older guys once we had our systems down with how to implement them, and we're going to continue to use them more throughout this summer and into next off season.
That's great.
Lee,
Can I mention one more thing on that,
absolutely.
Don, just real fast?
Yep.
So the great thing with the being able to create this kind of this innate stiffness, it's a stiffness that occurs because of this fast moving mass and momentum, is it creates an opportunity for the body to be able to manage that's the new stability that it has. And anytime we have new stability and we have this greater ability to stabilize, it allows us to unleash power greater, because now we have new stability. We can do it. So if I was unable to be able to manage this mass and momentum, my body might say, I don't know if I'm going to let you go that hard because I don't think you can handle it. Well, the fake throw stuff kind of says, all right, yeah, now I can really handle that stuff. Now I can release it better when it's ready to do that. So I think that's kind of important for people to understand. It's not just about doing the exercise for the core. It's about letting the nervous system say, yeah, I think I can do that. I think I can stabilize now that several joints here, and I can now really go hard on this. So it's kind of a fun strategy to use.
And if you guys as listeners are having trouble picturing some of this stuff, because it is a little obscure, I know we're going to get into in a minute or two here, different resources you could look up that Lee has, and he's got a lot of stuff on YouTube, especially a lot of the fake throws that we're talking about. Lee, you ready for a couple fun questions?
I am.
All right. First baseball game you ever attended?
It was 1975, 75 or 76. I went to Yankee Stadium, watched Lou Brock, Thurman Munson, Chris Chellis, Greg Nettles, Mickey Rivers, all these guys in Yankee Stadium. And of course, I was a fan of Lou Brock because he was a base stealer, and I liked Mickey Rivers. And Willie Randolph was young. And yeah, that was awesome. That was fun.
Cool. That would have been the first year that the new stadium reopened up, right? 75?
Yes.
Right around there, because they were in shape for a couple of years.
That's right.
Oh.
Yep.
All right. So wrapping up here. Other than yourself, what resources should baseball players and coaches look into about speed development?
About speed, well, again, I certainly not to say this because I'm just talking to you guys, but the stuff that you guys do relates to the ability to be faster. Certainly, anything that you guys have is fantastic. I think if you look at any other stuff, companies like Exos, Mike Boyle has some great stuff, and he's certainly worked with high-level players, and obviously his experience with the Sox and stuff. He does phenomenal work with them. So I think any of the really well-established facilities that understand conceptual training and strategies of how to move better, I think are fantastic. So some of the big hitters like Mike and certainly Mark Verstegen, Nick Winkelman, who actually works in rugby but had great input with baseball guys. And so I think guys like that are fantastic because the foundation of just human movement is so solid. And then I think the baseball stuff takes over from there.
So one thing I actually forgot to ask, and I meant to ask this a while ago, but I think it falls into this category too. You talk a lot about developing your eye as a coach.
Yeah.
How do you recommend younger coaches, either in the strength and conditioning field or baseball coaches that are trying to learn more about movement? What are kind of the best ways to go about just developing your eye?
Yeah, I without a doubt, and this is how I started because again, I had said I didn't have access to a lot of stuff, but I did have access to a big old clunky video camera and I'd watch old film. If you watch movement, so if you're a young coach who doesn't really have a model yet, you don't have a model of what movement should look like, what a baseball swing or a pitch or a throw or a run or anything should look like, just watch a lot of film and start to look at what's the foot doing? What is the knee doing? What's the hip doing? What's the upper body do as they go through these actions, whether it's base stealing or swinging or throwing? What will happen is you'll start to see commonalities. Without even having somebody tell you, you should look for this, you'll start to see, gosh, every time this guy does that, that's what I see. And I see that across whether it's a young kid or an older athlete. I see the same thing. So that's how I developed my eye. Then I started to say, okay, what does biomechanics and what does physics tell me? And that's how I developed my understanding of what I was seeing. And then nowadays, I strongly encourage to use their phone or if they have an iPad, videotape and just play it back, watch from the feet up and just keep working through the kinetic chain. And then all of a sudden, they'll be able to say, okay, that's really what the body's trying to do. Based on the skill, they might have to do it a little bit different because a hit is different than a throw. But a steal from first base, a throw from third base to first, and a hit have similar qualities, but they're just different because of that skill. And you develop those eyes by understanding what does human movement mean first. Then you can say, okay, this is what the specific skill does.
I love that answer. And I think anytime any coach under the age of probably 35, 40, hears about the process of setting up a video camera and having to replay it and et cetera, we all realize how fortunate we are that we have so many resources at our hands and literally in our hand most of the time to just get better. So just filming stuff and watching it and watching sports on TV, which you can pause your TV and rewind it and watch specific movements. And it's just, I think, a lot easier now if people are willing to put in the work.
Yeah. Oh, without a doubt. Well, I don't know if you saw, but I did a breakdown of a couple professional athletes. Some of them, much, they've been retired for years now. But all I did is that's what I did. I used my iPad. I happened to catch it on TV or on YouTube, and I just filmed it so that I could use the access of my software that I have to break down film. I just filmed it off YouTube, and then I could watch it as much as I want, and I could compare and contrast. So nowadays it's so easy to do that. So yeah, definitely use the technology we have, because that helps develop the eyes much quicker.
Definitely. And going into your stuff now, so what resources do you have that are applicable for or accessible right now for coaches?
Oh, well, thank you for allowing me to share that. Well, I think if they go to leadtaft.com, there's where they can find any kind of resources that they want to have, several things for baseball, other sports in general, or not sports, but other movement patterns in general, just to develop a better overall athlete. But I really encourage listeners, go to just search, Google Lee Taft YouTube, and it'll come up. I pretty much every day try to put something out there, speed related, even for older adults. But I do a lot for young. I probably have 200-300 videos, backlogged on there that they can find. And then I try to put stuff on the other social media outlets. It's funny because I started doing this because I know for so many years it was hard for me as a young coach to find resources, and I didn't want that to be the case now. So I try to share as much as I can just to kind of help the learning curve of, young or older coaches maybe wanting to learn something different or have a new strategy to add to their system. So yeah, any of those they can pretty much find whatever they're looking for.
Awesome. And I know, especially right now, with most of us, stuck at home for at least now, there's plenty of time to dig deep. And like you said, I know you've been doing it for at least a couple years, where you post stuff on YouTube pretty regularly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that stuff goes back, more than last week. Put it that way. Um,
Yeah.
anywhere else that listeners can find more about you, whether it's Instagram or
Yeah.
anywhere else?
Yeah, so any of the social medias, if they go to at Lee Taft, so I put something out at least once or twice, and I try to do a lot of video breakdown actually. So it's funny, John. I mentioned I have a 12-year-old son who we're on today would be day number 8 in a row of teaching him how to do a particular lift, and it's just for fun. It's we're teaching him. He wants to do it. He likes it. We do it about 10 minutes, but I'll often every few days I post on it, and I kind of do a little video breakdown of it. So what it does, again, it's just helping coaches being able to develop their eye of particular movements, and that's really what I try to do it for. So anything at Lee Taft, I put it on Instagram, I'll put it on Twitter, LinkedIn, I'll put stuff, and then also Facebook or and then of course YouTube. So yeah, so any of those they can pretty much find me, and I always get back to people if they ever want to reach out to me. Just I get back to people as soon as possible.
All right. I think that's it for today, Lee. Appreciate you coming on. I think hopefully the listeners got a lot out of this, and hopefully it can be a good use of time for them within the next week or two while we're stuck at home. But that concludes the episode for today. So I appreciate all you guys listening, and stay tuned for future updates about the upcoming episodes.
Hi everyone, it's Eric again. And now that the podcast with Lee is wrapped up and you've had a chance to really experience some of his expertise, I think it's important to wrap up as we talk a little bit more about a great resource that he's offering now at an awesome discount. I'm going to speak from my own experience when it comes to certifications. I always ask 3 specific questions. The first one is, will this experience provide me with specific information I wouldn't otherwise have? The second question is, will this experience provide information I can immediately apply in my interaction with my clients and my staff? And the third question is this experience delivered by one of the best in the business? Can this individual speak from perspective, or are they just an academic who hasn't worked with an actual person in years? So in other words, I'll do a certification for knowledge, but not necessarily for resume building. You'll see a lot of people that'll just chase the alphabet soup after their name. I want to make sure there are practical strategies that have been implemented in the trenches, not in some magical theoretical world. And that's where I think Lee really differentiates himself with this CSAC course. It's something that's really rooted in his experience, not just as a coach, but also as a teacher who's spoken at tons of seminars, taught coaches really how not just to utilize good cues, but how to use them efficiently so they can get results really quickly. Like I said, this was a course that was actually recorded at our Massachusetts facility that I've gotten behind as a mandatory viewing for all of our staff members. So I'd highly encourage you guys to check it out at ericcressey.com/CSAC. It's $150 off this week, and I can't recommend it highly enough.